Over the past few months, livestock has begun to vanish from the farms surrounding Hillbottom, so frequently that the farmers have started to worry that they may not have enough meat to feed their families over the coming winter. You've been hired and paid well by a very desperate townmaster to get to the bottom of these disappearances and put an end to them as quickly as possible. After some investigation, you discover tracks leading from these farms into the woods north of Hillbottom. Tracks made by more than one person that included drag marks that could easily have been made by pulling a large animal through the mud. After spending the better part of an afternoon following these tracks through the woods, you come upon a clearing. It appears you have found a long-forgotten cemetery, overlooked by a once beautiful chapel. By the state of the bush and the weeds, no one has used this place in decades. You would think this place was all but forgotten if it weren't for the faint, flickering candlelight emanating through the ornate glass atop the chapel. What do you do? Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Black Magic Craft. Just a little over a year ago, I started in on this crazy hobby. The first session I ever ran took place in a cemetery in a swamp and included a small chapel. This here was the first bit of terrain I ever built. A simple building made of cardboard, inspired heavily by the work of our master, DM Scotty. After a year's worth of crafting, I feel as though my techniques and abilities have come a long way since that first simple building. And in a way, I've come full circle and I've created another chapel, a chapel to replace this simple build. It's a project that I talked about in the last episode and one that I'm sure you've all seen many times by now in photographs on both the DM Scotty's Facebook group and on the Black Magic Facebook page. So I think now is a good time for us to take a closer look at some of the techniques and materials that I used to build it. So let's zoom on in and take a look. This is my completed chapel build, or as Hankerin at Drunkens and Dragons has named it, the Black Magic Cathedral. Like I mentioned in the last episode, this build was not something I had thought about in advance or planned. It was something that I just started making after a bit of a creative slump where I just pumped out a bunch of bricks and then had an idea to start building a chapel. So a lot of the decisions made on it weren't the best decisions and weren't what I probably would have done if I had planned this out like I normally do. But you know what? Sometimes those mistakes are good, and I just rolled with it, and I'm pretty happy with the end result, even if there's some small things I would have done differently. This project, like I said, started when I was out of ideas and I just started making bricks. And if you're wondering how I made those bricks, go back and watch the episode on ruins. That's where I talk about how I make individual bricks. The only difference is on this one, I made them thinner. These ones I actually made by cutting a few different thickness strips and then just cutting them with a knife into different brick sizes, and I threw them all in a tub and mixed them all up and worked with them by randomly grabbing them, which is what gives this different depth in the brick surface. I had someone comment on, I think one of the photos I posted of this, asking why I went with such different depths of bricks, because in reality, you wouldn't see a lot of buildings where they'd be done like this, right? Like they would typically try to make them smooth and even. This isn't very realistic, but I mean, it's a weird cathedral built for D&D, so realism isn't exactly the goal. And I like the different protrusions because at a distance on the table, it adds a lot of depth and makes it look a lot more 3D. It's accentuated, right? It takes the washes and the paints better. And the way I kind of think of terrain is kind of like theatrical makeup, where you have to overdo it and then it reads more subtly from a distance on the table. So that's kind of my thoughts. Also, I think it just makes it look a little bit more like it belongs in a fantasy setting rather just than in medieval Europe, right? You know what I mean? Made a bunch of bricks, and by the end of making them, I said, I'm gonna make a chapel. I started by just grabbing some cardboard, okay? Now, normally, I don't use cardboard in my builds, but the other goal with this build was to build it completely out of scraps and garbage. All the foam used was little cutoffs and random pieces that weren't really good for anything else. And I was actually running low on foam core. So I had some cardboard. I said, whatever, I'm just going to try out this technique of like using them as a facade kind of on a frame. I probably wouldn't use cardboard again in the future. I would just do this directly onto a structure made out of either foam core or 1/2-inch polystyrene, like the insulation foam. But it worked. It was fine. If that's all you have available, don't worry about it. It's good. I don't really like the cardboard because once you put all the glue on it, it does shrink and warp. You can see the front of this face. I don't know if you can tell, but it is a little bit bowed because of the glue causing the cardboard to warp. I kind of left it because I thought it looked okay on this. I thought it looked kind of interesting. I started by grabbing a piece of cardboard and no plan, just cut out this front piece. And I knew that I wanted something with a big round window at the top. So I cut out a circle and I wanted some kind of an interesting door. So the door I actually made, I'll give you a closer look here. The door is made out of insulation foam, and I used a technique that I believe I saw on the channel TWS, which is a really great terrain building channel. Unfortunately, all their videos are in German, but even so, they show a lot of the processes they use, and you can pick up a lot of cool techniques even if you don't speak German. So anyways, they, in one of their videos, showed making an ornate door, and basically what they did was they took a piece of insulation foam and cut it to the shape of 1/2 of a door. And you take that and, if it's an inch thick or whatever, you have that one side of a door. And then on the hot wire table, you actually do all these little designy scroll working things by just freehand running it through on the hot wire, and it creates a really nice pattern. But the real beauty of this technique is that you then take that styrofoam piece and you make slices, and you end up with 2 slices that are perfect mirror images. Because it would be really difficult to make a mirrored image like this on the hot wire table. So that's what I ended up doing on this one. I just wanted to test it out. It was the first and only time I've ever done that technique, and it's not perfect. And if this was a planned build, I probably would have done a few more tries until I got one that was really clean and really perfect looking. But at that point in this build, I was just messing around. Didn't really expect this project to continue and end up where it did. So in retrospect, I wish I would have put a little bit more effort into the door. But despite that, I think it still looks pretty sweet. Anyway, I had the front facade of this building, cut out a window, did the door, and then just started gluing bricks. And once I had the front piece, I just continued and I made the rest of the frame of the building out of the cardboard and just went ahead and glued bricks all over it. And yeah, I really liked the way it turned out. But when I got to making the sides, I thought it needed some extra embellishments. So that's when I decided to make these buttresses. I think that's what they're called. Buttress? Yeah, perhaps. Made those just 1/2-inch by 1/2-inch strips of insulation foam that I then carved these brick lines into. And those ones I actually did right on the hot wire table, just laid it down and just tapped it into the wire quickly to etch the line. By doing that and then rotating it on the table, it was a really fast way to make very square bricks. So I put those on the sides, and originally I did not have these ones on the front. I had put a lot of effort into making these bricks wrap around the corners nicely in a nice pattern. And once I had these on, I looked at it and I went, oh, it needs something on the front and back. And at that point, I kind of knew that I had wasted a bunch of time doing the brickwork on the corners, because this project would look much nicer if I did these stone embellishments. I was really hesitant to cut out the brickwork that I just put a bunch of time into, but I kind of live by the motto of don't defend a mistake just because you spent a lot of time making it. I eventually convinced myself, screw it, and I cut out the bricks on the four corners of the building, scraped them all off. The glue had already dried, so it was like a little bit difficult. And I will say that the Eileen's tacky glue that I used to glue it all on works very well. But once I got it off, I made these pieces, glued them in, and I was much happier with the look of this building. Because originally, without them, it kind of looked like a birdhouse, and I wasn't too thrilled about that. So I think this helped to make it look a little bit more dynamic. And once I got those on, I knew that this little chapel that I was envisioning was turning more into a dark cathedral, and I ran with that theme as I continued on. Once I had worked my way around the building with the brickwork and the buttresses, I then did a cardboard layer for the roof, and I did some embellishments on the stonework, just strips of polystyrene, and then I got to the shingles. And in the past, this has always been my most hated part of a build, is doing the shingles. And in the past, I've always done them out of cardstock. And it looks okay with cardstock. It's nice because it's a nice thin material to use, but it's hard to get texture on it, and it's a pain in the butt to cut all the shingles. Whether you do them individually or in strips, it makes no difference. It's time consuming and annoying. Being inspired by John's shingles, John from Dungeons and Gluesticks, I decided to try his method of making styrofoam shingles. I mean, realistically, that's right up my alley because I make everything else out of styrofoam. So I thought that method was kind of a match made in heaven. So I went with it, and I'm glad that I did, because one, it was way quicker, and I found it way more enjoyable than the cardstock. So I think from here on out, that is my method. There's a few different ways you can approach cutting shingles out of styrofoam. You can cut thin strips of styrofoam and then cut the shingles out of that, and do different widths and thicknesses or whatever. But because I wanted these shingles to have that rounded corner, I didn't want these to look like wood shingles. I wanted them to look more like slate or clay shingles. I wanted them to have these rounded corners, and that wouldn't be as easy to do with a strip this way where you cut the shingles like this. I'd then have to nip the corners, which is part of the reason the cardstock shingles take so long. So I came up with the idea of doing it a little bit differently. I made, it was I think 3/4 by 1/2 inch sticks of insulation foam, and then I sliced it basically like deli meat. Before I sliced it, I took that material and with a nail file, I beveled the two of the corners. So I was able to just quickly bevel the two edges, and it gave me basically a tube that was the shape of these shingles that I could then slice into thin slices, and it very quickly gave me a whole bunch of shingles with this shape. I found that way faster. Like I would say this roof compared to my other houses where I did cardstock, it maybe took me 1/3 of the time, and it was more fun, and I think it actually has a better look to it. I did this roof in, I think, one evening. Eileen's tacky glue, just individually glued them on, no grid or anything, just kind of eyeballed it, and I was really happy with the way it turned out. I think it looks good. I finished it off by putting this kind of stone cap on the top, and that is, again, like almost everything I do, start with milling a stick of insulation foam, but then I cut a rabbet in it. So basically I got a corner piece, like an L-shaped piece of foam, that sat right on top, did a few etches for some accent lines, and that was that. Once the shingles were done, I didn't have these spikes on yet and I didn't have a base, but for some reason I decided to go into painting. I guess I had thought that it was done and I just went into painting it. So I based the whole thing with my regular mixture of matte Mod Podge mixed with black acrylic paint, and I did that over the whole thing to give it a protective coating and kind of give me the initial black coat. And usually when I do that, I end up giving it another quick brushing of black paint, because the black paint mixed with the Mod Podge doesn't give you a very solid covering. But when I looked at it, I kind of liked the way the colors were showing through, because, well, one, I had made this out of two different types of insulation foam, some pink and some blue. Before anybody asks, there was no reason that these parts were made out of blue and these parts were made out of pink. Like I said, I was making this out of scrap material, and it's just kind of the way it worked out with what I grabbed. There isn't much difference between the pink and the blue. There is a difference, but it's not a difference worth worrying about until you get to kind of high level building. If you're starting out in foam building, just buy whatever you can, it doesn't really matter. When I put the Mod Podge mixture on, it was letting some of the colors show through, and it just so happened that the main bricks were the pink and all the embellishments were the blue, and I could kind of already see that I wanted to do a two-tone color on the paint job. And with those colors showing through, I thought that might actually help with the paint, give it a bit more of a natural look rather than mixing in color to the various stages of gray to make it look more realistic. So I left it at that, and then I went directly into the base coat of color. And I decided that the bricks and the accents would be two different types of stone. So all the accents I painted with Craft Smart graphite is the color. I like it for stuff like this rather than just like the dark gray, because it's a very blue gray. It has a bit of a different look to it. So that's what I used on all the accents. The brickwork I decided to do in a tan. This Craft Smart tan is the color, and that gave it a nice kind of dynamic look between the two different types of stone. And then the shingles I coated in a purple, and it was a purple that I mixed myself, so I can't tell you the color. I made it from a mix of purple and burgundy. I never showed you the 360. If you want to just take a look at, I'll throw the back over here so you can see what that looks like for a bit. So once I had those three base coat colors on, I then went ahead and did my dry brushing. I just used first of all, a light gray dry brushing, and I did that over all three colors. I didn't do a separate dry brush color on each, just did the light gray over everything. And then when that was done, I did a second dry brushing in a cream that's basically like an off-white. And again, I did that over everything, although I was careful to not overdo it on the darker accenting stones, trying only to hit the edges and going a little bit more heavy on the brickwork and the shingles. After that, I did my typical black wash, which I have a video about if you haven't seen it yet. Went over everything, and what happens if you base coat your like brickwork in a tan, at first you might think, ooh, this is way too off, like it's way too light and it's way too brown. But the tan with the black wash, I find, gives an excellent brick color that is a nice change to just the typical two-tone gray. I really like the way it turns out after the black wash. So then once the black wash was done, I wanted it to have a more weathered look, like a little bit mossy, but I didn't feel like covering this in flock. I didn't want the moss to be, a huge part of it. I just wanted a little bit of implied damp grime. So I made a green wash. I basically just took some water and some dark green paint, and I made a little batch of a wash that I went and put on a few small spots in corners and stuff where water would sit. It's not drastic, it's just a little accent. You can see I did some right on underneath the window to the door, but it's very, very subtle, right? But I think it's those little details that take something from good to fantastic. And my paintwork is the part of terrain building that I think could stand to have the most improvement. I'm getting pretty confident and happy with my sculpting abilities with styrofoam. I mean, it can always be better, but I think it's quite good. But I've always felt that my paintwork didn't do it justice, and this may be the first project where I really pushed hard to put a little bit more effort into the paint job, and I think it shows, and I think I'm on the right path to getting to be where I want to be with my paintwork. So once that was all dried, I realized, oh, this thing should have a base, because with my buildings, I don't like having the roof lift off for gameplay. I like being able to take the whole thing right off and being left with the floor plan so that you can play out your scenario without the obstruction of the walls. Usually I just use a piece of 1/2-inch insulation foam, and I pen scribe in whatever brick or wood plankings I want. So that's where I went with this initially. Basically just set this down on a piece of styrofoam and traced out the shape, a little bit oversized, and I was left with this shape. I started drawing in my brickwork with a pen, and after I looked at it, I felt like the scribed brickwork on the base did not look as good as the more 3D individual brickwork on the building. So I made the decision to layer this with individual pieces, just like the building itself. So I went around the sides and I put in individual bricks. These ones are basically the same as the ones on the building, except they are thinner. So I went all the way around, did those bricks, and then I did a border and the stairs. Again, each one of these are individual bricks. And then for the floor, I wanted something a little bit different. So I made this floor exactly the same way I made the floor on one of my ruins, which is by just making thin slices from a square stock piece of insulation foam, where I've slightly sanded the corners to bevel them. And I like that because it leaves these voids, and it kind of helps make the bricks look more individual rather than scribed in. So once that was done, just gave it the whole tinfoil ball texture, and then I had to paint this one and try to match it to the building. And I actually think that the paint job on the floor alone came out even better than on the building, and I really like the way this looks. So much so that I think I'm going to do another batch of dungeon tiles in this method, because I really like the individual brickwork. I think it looks super sharp. So the base was done, the building was done. It didn't have the stained glass window yet, but as I was looking at it, I felt like it was just slightly missing something and could stand to be a little bit more sinister in appearance. And that's when I got the idea to add all of these iron spikes, and basically just took some toothpicks, poked holes in everything. There's a nice thing about styrofoam, you can just poke into it, and just cut some toothpicks and put them in place with a dab of tacky glue and let it dry, and they stiffened up quite nicely. I mean, they're pretty deep. They're probably about a 1/2 inch embedded into everything, so they're pretty stable. The only problem is that I did this after everything was already painted. So I then had to go in and paint these without kind of screwing up the rest of the thing, which would be fine, except there was like the little holes, you know, that revealed like unpainted styrofoam a bit. So it was a little bit annoying, and the paint didn't turn out as good as it probably would have had I done this initially. Like, I think if I had put those in before painting, you would have painted everything out, and it would have been a much more seamless kind of install if I'd painted all together. But, you know, hey, sometimes you just got to do what you got to do. The other thing I guess I didn't mention is the paint job on the door. I just used a metallic paint. It's like a brass or bronze paint mixed with a bit of silver, and the door handles are the same jewelry bits that I used on my watchtower on the gate there. So you can get those at the craft store at Michael's I think it's in like the bracelet section. So once that was all done, I was left with only the stained glass window, and throughout the whole build I knew eventually I would have to make it, and I knew that I wanted it to be a pretty prominent feature, and that I didn't want to just do something crappy. I wanted it to be pretty good. In my head, I thought it would be a simple matter of just getting a piece of plastic, clear plastic, and using marker or paint of some kind to do the stained glass. But I needed something to do the lead work, the lines. I wanted those to be actually like 3D elements, not just to be painted on lines. So I thought a bunch about how to do that. I could have used toothpicks or something, but I thought that would be too big. I needed something pretty thin to do that. So what I ended up coming up with was I bought some very fine leather bracelet wire. It was just in black. And so I got the design that I wanted. I printed it out to scale to the same size as the window, and then I taped a piece of clear plastic over top. And then I used that leather bracelet wire and super glue to basically trace it out. And I would just take a line of super glue and trace it onto the pattern underneath, and then just embed the wire. And it was a little bit tedious, but it actually didn't take that long, and it worked pretty well. So then I was left with this window that had the leading on it, but no color. And I did some tests with markers and paints, and everything I had did not work good. The markers didn't apply to the plastic. It was too glossy. Any of the paints I had didn't work. So what I ended up doing was, I knew that you could get like these stained glass kits for kids. I knew that they existed. I went to the dollar store, and I actually did find something that I thought would work. It was these window decoration light catcher things. And I bought that, and I tested it out, and I thought that it would be perfect. So I took the paint that came with it, put it into my little window that I just put a bunch of effort into making the shape, and it looked terrible. Honestly, guys, it looked awful. The paint applied really unevenly, and then they're putting in more than one coat to even it out. It was not translucent enough to let light through, and I was not happy with it, so I scrapped it. And so I made a second window, did the lead work again, which actually went really fast this time because I'd already done it once. I'm betting it only took me under half hour to do, but I needed a way to do the color, and I had this set of markers with all these different colors, and I figured that's the best thing, but it won't draw on the plastic. So I kind of looked through what I had to figure out what would work, and I found some tracing paper. I had some opaque tracing paper, and I tested it out, and the markers applied to it in a great way that gave even color, but also stayed very translucent and allowed light through it. So basically what I did was, I had this plastic with the lead work on it, and then on a piece of tracing paper I did the coloring, and I glued the two together, and it created a pretty darn good look. It wasn't quite where I wanted it to be because it still looked a little too bright and fake for this building, but it was close. So I did that, and then I decided on the leather work, or on the lead work, leather strips, to just take some metallic paints and dry brush it, and to make them look more like metal. And I liked the way that looked, and then I got kind of ballsy. I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna try. And I took the metallic paint and I just stippled it onto the plastic where the colored glass would be, and that was what made this really work, because it made it look, one, a little bit darker and grimier, and it also gave it a lot more depth, and it had like kind of this glittery, kind of sparkly look to it. And then I was sold. I'm like, that's it. So I installed it into the back of the building, but it still needed glass, like, because this lead work was on the surface, so it was protruding and it didn't really make sense. So I figured the obvious thing to do would be to pour resin in here. So I took the building, stood it on end like this, and I poured in some acrylic water. Now, I used the acrylic water that you saw me use in my water feature tutorial. It's the stuff from Walmart that is about the third of the price of the Envirotech stuff at Michael's, and it's like a floral acrylic water, and it's a great bargain. But I've had a few problems with it, having used it more. One, I've learned, and other people have learned the hard way, that if you mix in any kind of color, paint, or ink to it, it will not cure. So, okay, fine. I put it in this, thinking I'm not mixing any paint in it. It'll be fine, it'll cure. And I just used it recently on another project and it was fine. I mixed it up, got my ratios correct, mixed it up thoroughly, transferred it into a different cup, mixed it again, and then poured it. And guess what? 2 days later, it still hadn't cured. I do not know what the problem with this stuff is. I don't know if it has to do with the shelf life or what, but I did everything that I was supposed to do to get the resin to cure properly, and it didn't freaking cure. A bit of a disaster. So anyway, I dabbed out all the uncured resin, and I was kind of at square one again. So I figured, okay, you know what, screw this stuff. I'm not using it anymore. I'm going to get the Envirotech's light stuff, because that's what lots of people use. It works well. You can mix stuff into it, and I've heard that it has a lot less problems with curing. But I wanted to finish this, and I didn't have a chance to get to Michael's where they sell it. But I was at the dollar store, and I remembered a video by Luke's Affordable Paint Service, where he was doing water effects with dollar store 5-minute epoxy. Basically the stuff in the syringe that it mixes and dries in 5 minutes that you would use as an adhesive. And he used it for water effects, and it seemed to look pretty good. It dries clear. And I figured for $1 I'm gonna try it, mostly because it was something that would cure really fast, and then I could just have it done and feel good about it and move on. I was not mentally up for another 72-hour wait for resin to cure after having a failure. I just wanted to see it cured and done. So I did a test with that, and it worked great. So that's what I did. I mixed that up and I poured it in, and it's very thick to work with. It's not, I wouldn't recommend it for stuff where you want it to like pour perfectly flat and not get on anything. It's very, very viscous. So I poured it in and I kind of had to work it a bit with a stick to get it to the point where it was kind of evenly coverage. But then after a minute, it evened out enough and it dried fast. Like within 5 minutes, it was done. And this thing it's hard, and it dried perfectly clear. So I'm happy with it. I think it was a great solution for $1. And then after that, I just needed to put some lights in it. And like I mentioned before, I have a bunch of parts coming in the mail to do integrated lighting, but they haven't all arrived yet. But this was a big open space, so I figured I can just use a tea light, and that's what I did. So inside you can see just this cardboard frame, very simple. And I just took a tea light and I cut a piece of styrofoam to hold it in place, right? And it basically projects light out the front. Real simple, real easy. I think once I get my all my parts for lighting, I'll probably run some integrated lighting into this, just because I have so much coming that I'll be able to do kind of as much as I want. So that is that. After everything was at that point and done, one heavy coat of Minwax polyurethane, as I always do, because I love the way it makes this stuff look. I like the slightly wet look. It really enhances the colors, adds some protection, and good to go. Now I just have to think of a adventure to run for my party utilizing this. I know that some of you guys will see this and implement some of this stuff into your own builds. If you do, please share it with me on the Black Magic page. Make a post on there. I like seeing it. And of course, most of you are on DM Scotty's Crafts and Games Facebook page, and you like to post stuff there. So if you guys post anything on there that is in any way inspired by some of the stuff I've shown you, please tag or write Black Magic Craft in it, so that I don't miss it, and so that we can turn some more people onto the channel. Also, if you want to use a chapel like this in your game, but you don't have the time or energy to build it, good news. Hankering over at Drunken and Dragons just released on Drive-Thru RPG an index card set, which is basically, I can't remember how much, maybe 100 hand-drawn different dungeon and adventuring elements on index card size that you download, you print out, and you can lay out a dungeon or an adventure using those. And it's pretty cool. He actually made one of the cards is the Black Magic Cathedral. So if you go over to Drive-Thru RPG and download that set and print it out, you can implement a Black Magic Cathedral without having to build one. I will put the link in the video description below, and please go check it out. Support Drunkens and Dragons, because without his channel, Black Magic Craft probably would not exist as a channel. So the more love you can give him, the better. And as always, Black Magic Craft could use your support, so please like this video, leave a comment below, and if you haven't already subscribed, hit subscribe, tell your friends. And you know what, if you want to be part of the Black Magic community, go over to Facebook, look at the Facebook page there, like it, comment, all those other good things. So anyway, until next time, guys, peace, have a good one.